Welcome to session 37 of our class on understanding biblical literature. We are in the last chapter of the book that covers Old Testament wisdom. In the second slide of the PowerPoint, the wisdom books consist of the books of Proverbs, Job, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Songs. And it's Derek Kidner in slide number 3 that makes this statement. He says, the wisdom books summon us to think hard as well as humbly, to keep our eyes open, to use our conscience and our common sense, and not to shirk disturbing questions. So the idea is that, as we see in slide number 4, that the imperative of wisdom literature is think. Now, in slide number 5, we notice that the theological foundation of wisdom is the fear of the Lord. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, Proverbs 1 and verse 7. Now, the fact is that the fear of the Lord, number one, the word fear is not a cowering down, waiting to be destroyed type of thing, but it's respect, it's awe, that to be in awe of the Lord God of the universe, Jehovah God, and to respect Him, to obey Him for who and what He is. He's the creator, the sustainer, the giver of life, and all that is and ever was. Everything we have, even the water that we drink, the air that we breathe, the food that we eat, the clothes that we wear, the houses we live in, and on and on and on. Every single thing we have is a gift from Him. Okay? It comes from Him. He is all that there is. And all that should be, that our lives should be about. Again, He is the very foundation, should be the very foundation of our lives. We look at the world through His eyes, with His thoughts that He gives in His Word. Our whole life should consist of pleasing Him. And just as we said in the last in the last video, there's 2 commandments upon which hang the whole law and the prophets. And that is, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. The very idea that everything that we do is summed up in those 2 things. Now, I know Jesus was speaking of the law and the prophets, and we've talked about how we're not under those today, but the fact is that the New Testament can be summed up that way too. Our relationship with God and our relationship with our fellow human beings. So, we must understand that the Lord began all things, and He should be the beginning of all things for us. Specifically in this passage, the beginning of knowledge. The knowledge we have of the earth, of the universe, the knowledge we have of everything around us and even of ourselves should start with respecting God for who He is, for His character, for what He has done, and on and on and on we could go. All right. Starting with this theological foundation and using the salvation account, the wisdom books build a practical theology for living life faithfully each day. Um, excuse me. So the wisdom books are about life, about everyday life. Um, and in slide number 7, we see the goal of wisdom literature, and that is the formation of godly character within ourselves. That's what it's about. The basic approach to life is found in Proverbs. Proverbs presents the rational, ordered norms of life. The teachings are norms, not universals. And the idea there is that there are statements in Proverbs such as the statement that says, "I've never seen the righteous begging bread." Well, we have a very clear example in Scripture, in the Gospels. You have Lazarus and the rich man that is told of by Jesus, where the rich man goes into torment when he dies, and Lazarus, who is a beggar, goes into paradise, into Abraham's bosom. When he dies, he's carried by the angels to Abraham's bosom. So, the idea of "I've never seen the righteous begging bread" is a norm. That's normally the case, but it's not always the case. Another one is "Train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it." Again, that's a general truth. It's not true in every single situation, because we see people raised in Christian homes. We see them be an outstanding young person as they are growing up, and so forth. But at some point, either while they're still at home or after they've left home, they become unfaithful. And so again, "Train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it," is a general statement. It's not true in every single instance. Now, concerning the suffering of the righteous, we see this in the book of Job. In slide number 9, the proverbial approach, that is the approach of Proverbs, cannot grasp or understand every aspect of life. Again, they are norms, not universals, because, again, tragedy strikes even the wise and the righteous, such as Job. And, Solomon says that, time and chance happens to them all. A tragedy may strike you or someone close to you because you're just simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. Nothing more, nothing less. But the key to understanding Job is to understand that, again, tragedy strikes even the wise and the righteous, but also in the midst of tragedy, we need to rely on the Creator. You might have heard the phrase, "God is good all the time." All the time, God is good. Whatever happens to us, as Paul puts it, can be used to the glory of God. Just how we handle it. Paul says all things work together for good to those who love the Lord. Okay? So the idea is that whether it's good or bad, all things, good or bad, work together for good to those who love the Lord. As someone else has put it, whenever a tragedy strikes, or whenever we have hard times, they're either going to make you better or they're going to make you bitter. It just depends on your attitude and your approach, your reaction to these problems of life. Okay? Next, in slide number 10, we see in the book of Ecclesiastes the failure of the rational to provide meaning. The book of Ecclesiastes is simply an intellectual search for meaning in life. And there are numerous exceptions to the ordered rational universe that are revealed. As we will talk about in more detail later, there's a phrase in the book of Ecclesiastes that is repeated many times, and it says, under the sun. It speaks of life under the sun. Well, what that means is that you just have a very, earthly, human outlook on life. But as we will see, the last few verses of the book of Ecclesiastes says, let's hear the conclusion of the whole matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole of man. Some translations say, for this is the whole duty of man. But the word duty is not there in the text. It simply says, this is the whole of man. This is man's all. This is what we should be striving for. It should be the number one thing in our life, and everything else in our life is subsumed under that one thing. Fear God, respect God, obey God, keep his commandments. For this is all that we are to be about. Now, again, as we said, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, with your whole being, and love your neighbor as yourself. So the fact that if you love God, okay, if you obey God, if you respect God for who and what he is, then you are going to do your best to get along with others. Okay? But the fact is that, as the last point on this slide says, meaning in life is only found through a relationship with God. Okay? And everything else falls under that. When it falls under that, doing things from God's perspective, thinking about things from God's perspective, then life has meaning. Okay? We have a purpose, and our purpose is to glorify God. Okay? People always talk about finding their purpose. They want to find their purpose or their calling in life. Well, it is true that God gives us our abilities, and he gives us also the ability to learn something else. Okay, to gain knowledge about something that we've never studied before. And certainly we must do our best to do something that we're also glad to be doing. Okay, you don't want to get into a job or a situation where you hate going to work every day, or you hate what you're doing all the time. But there's also the idea of keeping a counterbalance or a balance of all this, that sometimes we have to do the things we don't like to do in order to be able to do what God wants us to do. Okay? But for the most part, God has left it open to us, again, within the boundaries of his will, as to what to do with our lives. Okay? So I hope you understand what I'm I'm getting at here. The whole idea of calling and purpose is true in the sense that God has called us and given us a purpose of glorifying Him. That's the main purpose. That should be the only thing that we focus on. But whatever career we choose, in our homes, in our jobs, in our congregations, we should find the niche that we feel, okay, something that we would enjoy doing, okay, for the most part. Not so much in the family. Let me set that aside for just a second. But do something we're good at, something that we enjoy, and as long as all of that is brought under the umbrella of glorifying God, then it's good and right. Okay? We don't necessarily have to pray for God to reveal to us a particular thing that we need to be doing. Again, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying prayer is not needed. Certainly prayer is needed, and we can affect the choice of God and the will of God through prayer, as is shown throughout the Scriptures. But again, the idea is that whatever we do, it should be in a way that glorifies God. Okay, so therefore we're not going to be involved in sin trying to glorify God. We do what He says to do, and in that way glorify Him. Okay, but again, the main thing I want to bring out here is the fact that Ecclesiastes seems and is so pessimistic about even good things, because they're looked at only from an earthly standpoint. It does not bring God into account. Okay, so, much study is wearisome to the flesh, and the making of books there is no end. Is it wrong to study? No, it's not wrong to study. Is it wrong to write a book? Absolutely not. Okay, but if you're just talking about things from an earthly perspective, then yeah, it's useless. Okay, it really, in the end, it has no meaning whatsoever. Okay, now again, don't get me wrong. You might write a book on salvation. You might write a book on encouragement. You might write a book on how to improve your life. Okay, but even then, if those books do not contain God's perspective on all these things, then they're nothing. Okay, you can't improve yourself just of your own self or just among humanity. Okay, because if we get to the point where we say I can pull myself up by my own bootstraps, so to speak, I can improve myself, and I can improve myself by myself or with the help of some other human beings, and I'm the one who's responsible for all of my improvement, for everything I accomplished. I did it, and no one else did anything, with the idea of no one else being God. And so, again, it's good to improve, but if you improve without God in the picture, then you've accomplished nothing. You might have accomplished something in this life, but again, that's just looking at things from this life. You can be the richest person in the world and have nothing, as if no meaning, no purpose, no will to live kind of thing. In fact, I was listening to a video the other day on YouTube. A very famous Christian apologist. He's very famous in that arena, and he made the statement that he was having lunch or dinner. He was having a meal with just a few weeks or a few days before this particular presentation. He had a meal with the 7th richest person in the world. Okay. And that man said to this other man, he said, when I got to the point where I could buy anything I wanted, when I got to the point where I could afford anything and everything my heart desired, he said, life lost its meaning for me. I didn't need anyone else. I didn't need any relationships. He didn't say these words, but the idea is there. I didn't need anybody else. I was self-sufficient. Okay? And what he's saying is that he didn't even think he needed God. And that's where we go wrong. Because Paul did not say that money is the root of all evil. He said the love of money is the root of all evil. Okay? So Ecclesiastes looks at things from a human standpoint. That's why it's so pessimistic. But at the end, it gives the answer to everything. And then in the Song of Songs, slide number 11, we find the irrationality of romantic love. It celebrates the wild, irrational, mushy, and corny aspects of true love. And as we will see later, it is very, if you understand the language of that particular time, and you understand what is being said among the figures of speech, in the Song of Songs, or another title is the Song of Solomon, you will understand that it is very, very erotic, very graphic in places, but it's within the marriage bond, okay? And within the marriage bond, sex is a beautiful thing, and it's a wonderful thing. It is something to be enjoyed just for the sake of enjoyment. It's not just for procreation. It's not just about having children. It is about the enjoyment that can be had from it also. And that usually is the main reason that it's done. Okay, so this is what the Song of Solomon talks about in many ways. Now, a large majority of wisdom literature is poetic, so therefore you are going to need to go back to chapter 20, and again, just like you did with the prophets and their poetic parts, you'll need to understand the principles of interpreting poetry as well as wisdom literature. Parallelism is the standard structural feature of wisdom literature. An example of parallelism in wisdom literature is in Job 6 and verse 2, slide number 14. If only my anguish could be weighed and all my misery be placed on scales. This is certainly synonymous parallelism. In Song of Songs 1 and verse 10, your cheeks are beautiful with earrings, your neck with strings of jewels. Again, um, synonymous parallelism. Although the cheek and the neck are certainly different parts of the body, but it's really talking about the beauty, okay, of these things. Now, wisdom literature also relies on figurative imagery to communicate its message, so that should be understood and clear in our looking at these things. Now, in slide 17, we need to understand that in the book of Proverbs, we must always understand that individual proverbs, again, reflect general nuggets of wisdom and not universal truths. We've already covered that to a good extent. So, for example, in Proverbs 10 and verse 4, lazy hands make for poverty, but diligent hands bring wealth. Well, certainly there are exceptions to that. Okay? So, again, we've covered that. Now, concerning Proverbs and grasping the text in their town, we need to make sure we explore the literary context. Certainly it's in the wisdom context, but it's also a great majority of it, as we said, is poetry. So we need to, again, use poetic interpretation principles. We need to look at the historical background not only of the culture of Israel, but also we need to understand wisdom literature in the ancient Near East, and just exactly what kind of things were taught in that wisdom literature, and what was the basis of that wisdom literature. Because there are other wisdom books outside the Bible from Egypt and Babylon and other places, okay? But the main difference would be that even though they might cover the same things and might even say very similar things, those things are not based on the God of the Bible. And therefore they're not based on the one true God. They might be based on what their pagan gods, as far as their belief in their pagan gods, it might very well be said, because so-and-so God requires this, this, and this is the best way to do this, blah, blah, blah. But again, it's based on some pagan god, and therefore it would be, even though what it says is right, it would be wrong in its foundation as to its idea of why that is true. But the wisdom of the Bible, the wisdom books of the Bible, base their wisdom in the character of Jehovah God. Note also the structure and basic units of the book. Again, as we will see later, as we've seen already, in other chapters, I think in poetry, you have sometimes 2 lines, sometimes 3 lines that are connected together, sometimes 4, and sometimes several verses that are connected by a theme, okay? I think the first several chapters of Proverbs, the basic theme is the prostitute, and how a wise man avoids that situation, okay? All right. Measuring the width of the river across in Proverbs, we must note the agrarian context of Proverbs, the fact that the main job of people of that time, even if their regular job was something other than farming, they still had to grow some of their own food. Some people were farmers just by profession, but even the people that lived in the city probably had a field outside the city where they could grow some of their own food. And then also you need to note the references to kings in the Proverbs. In crossing the principalizing bridge in slide number 21, typically the proverb is already a general principle. And keeping in mind that these are not universal promises, that they are generally true, okay, then there's really not much thinking that has to go into developing a theological principle. As we saw earlier, the lazy suffers for being lazy, but the diligent will have what he needs. Okay, that's not an exact quote, but the idea is that again, that's a general principle. It's not always true in every single instance, but it is generally true that if you work hard, you're going to get rewarded for that, whether it be in a greater amount of money or whether it be in a greater amount of prestige and respect, or whatever. You're going to have what you need. Okay. So again, the point is that the theological principle is usually pretty well stated. Okay. And then consulting the biblical map, there are many themes of Proverbs that are affirmed in the New Testament. However, we need to keep in mind that the theme of wealth as a blessing from God does undergo an alteration. That is, under the Old Covenant and the wisdom literature of that time, the blessings were primarily physical. Again, you do what I say, and I'll bless you in your crops and in your homes and in your family and so forth and so on. And if you don't do what I say, then I will take away your crops. I will destroy your family. I will, on and on and on. Deuteronomy 28 being the prime example. But under the New Testament, spiritual blessings are the main theme of the reward that we are to receive because of our obedience to God, or as a result of our obedience to God. So, and the idea of suffering is another thing that has somewhat changed a good bit. Again, Job tells us that the righteous suffer, but for the most part, the rest of the Old Testament tells us that the unrighteous will suffer. Again, Deuteronomy 28 being the prime example. But under the New Testament, if you suffer for righteousness' sake, you are blessed. Okay? That's very clearly stated in the New Testament. Even there in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus says, "Blessed are you when they persecute you and do all manner of things against you." So we need to understand that there is a shift from the physical blessings of the wisdom literature to the blessings of the New Testament. The blessings here, again, are mainly spiritual. So just because you're poor, just because you're being persecuted in this life, in this day and time, does not mean that you're being punished by God. Okay? As it generally would have meant under the Old Testament. Okay? Again, Job and other situations being the exceptions to that. And then grasping the text in their town, again, we need to catch the big picture of being what the text tells us to be. Tell the truth. Be honest. Be a person of integrity. Be wise in your parenting and in your dealing with money, and on and on and on we should go or could go. Now, as far as Job, grasping the wisdom books, slide 24, we need to always remember to situate smaller passages into the context of the complete story. In fact, in chapter 1 through chapter 2 and verse 10, Job is afflicted. In chapter 2, 11 through 37, 24, the majority of the book, Job and his friends search unsuccessfully for a rational answer. So when you come to 38:1 through 42:6 in slide 26, this is where God answers Job's accusations, and you find that in 42:7 through 17, Job's friends are rebuked by God and Job is restored. So the idea is that in slide number 27, the central lessons are not seen until chapter 38 through 42:17. And Job's friends are negative characters that are not to be emulated. Okay? In those chapters of chapter 2, verse 11 through 37, chapter 37, most of the time, if you look at what Job's friends say, then you say, well, that is something I don't need to be doing. Okay? Now, the last person to speak before God speaks to Job seems to be pretty much on track, because God does not rebuke him. Okay? And I forget his name. But the first three friends are not to be imitated. Now, again, we need to make sure we identify the literary context, but we also need to put the passages before chapter 38 in context with chapter 38 through 42:17. You can't just take a passage from the first part of Job and interpret it without considering the context of 38 through 42 chapters. All right. Measuring the width of the river to cross, we cannot assume that all tragedy is connected to satanic involvement. Accidents happen, and nobody's responsible. I didn't commit a sin that resulted in this tragedy happening. Okay? Or it's not necessarily Satan that has been released by God to particularly afflict me. Okay? Now, can consequences come from the choices I make concerning sin? Yes, they can. But just because something bad happens to you doesn't mean that Satan is the one who's doing it to you. Crossing the principalizing bridge, we need to understand that the river is narrow and shallow, so the principles are fairly straightforward. Again, especially from chapters 38 through 42. Consulting the biblical map, the New Testament does not repeat the picture of peace and prosperity as a result of righteous living. Again, the Old Testament was a very physical thing. Okay, we talked about how physical war was used to advance God's purposes. Now, it's not. So, again, the idea of peace and prosperity is not found in the New Testament to come from righteous living. There is no health and wealth gospel. Is it true that God blesses us when we do what he says? Absolutely. But it's not going to necessarily be, and probably most of the time, it's not going to be with money. And it's not going to be with health. Okay? Certainly, if we take care of our bodies and so forth, then generally we're going to be healthy. But I know some very, very righteous people who are presently struggling with cancer. I had a dear, dear friend, one of my mentors, in 2015, the latter part of 2015. He got sick and they couldn't determine what was going on. So by January or February, they figured out he had leukemia. That would be January or February of 2016. And he fought that for another year. Okay? He died February the 1st of 2017. But he was one of the greatest giants spiritually that I've ever known. And I'm thankful for the chance that I got to work with him for about 10 years. I learned a lot. But he got leukemia and he died. So again, peace and prosperity, health and wealth is not what is found in the New Testament. Okay? It's found in Job and it's found in other parts of the Old Testament, but it's not a part of New Testament doctrine or New Testament teaching. And then consulting the biblical map, slide number 31, the New Testament suggests again that righteous people glorify God by enduring unjust suffering. And then grasping the text in their town, again, or in our town, I'm sorry. I thought I had changed that. Our focus in grief should not be on why something is happening to us, but on God and his character. Now, certainly, if we have sinned and we are suffering the consequences of it, we've brought this on ourselves, such as, cirrhosis of the liver because of drinking. But then, there are people who get cirrhosis of the liver who've never drank a drop of alcohol in their life. Okay, I'm not saying that that's the only way you get cirrhosis of the liver, but if you got cirrhosis of the liver due to alcoholism, then you've brought that on yourself, and you need to accept responsibility for that. But at the same time, once you've accepted responsibility for that, rely on God in turning to him away from the alcoholism, turning to him and rely on even if you know the why, turn to God, rely on him and his character for strength to get through it. And then again, hurt and suffer with those who experience tragedy. Don't be like Job's friends and tell him, well, you're experiencing all this because you must have sinned really bad. Okay? No. In fact, when you go to someone, whether they've lost a loved one or whether they're in the midst of disease and trial and trouble of any kind, the best thing you can do is just, number one, let them know you love them, and just be with them. Okay, just be there, just be present. Please do not tell a person who has lost a child, please do not tell them God needed another angel. That's one of the worst things you could do. And the same goes for anyone who dies. Okay? Whether they be young or old, Please don't tell them that. And don't tell them, I know how you feel, because you don't know how they feel. Yes, you might have lost a mother, and they have lost a mother, or whoever, if you've lost the same person, relationship in your life, okay? Your mother died, their mother died. You can't say to them, I know how you feel, because they may have had a completely different relationship with their mother. You may have had a great one and they had a bad one. And maybe they're actually a little glad that, this person is now out of their life and can't abuse them or beat them or just run them down all the time. Okay? Yeah, they're going to have some grief, but you don't know how they feel. Okay? So the idea is that we each experience our own grief in our own way. So the best thing you can do is just be there. There's a story told of a man who went to a family's house. They had lost a loved one. He walked in, he let them know he's there for them. If they need anything, he wants to do anything they want him to do. He loves them. And then he goes in the living room and he sits in the corner. And he sits there for several hours. He might talk to some of the other people coming in. He might talk to some family members, during that time. But basically he just sits there. He's just present in their grief. And when he gets up to leave, they are so thankful for him being there. Hasn't said hardly anything, but just his presence. Another story tells of a man who goes to visit a family that's lost a loved one, and while he's there, he gets their shoes, and he polishes their shoes because he knows they're going to be going to a funeral here in a day or two. And he doesn't say much to them. He just polishes their shoes. And, we always, take people food and so forth. Just do for them and be there for them, but don't try to tell them that you somehow know how they're feeling, or that God knew that God needed another angel, and that's why he took your loved one. That simply just is just bad form. It's rude, and I know your intentions are wonderful, but number one, I don't believe that when we die we become angels. There's nothing said about that. In fact, there is a lot of stuff said about, several things said about angels being created, and that they were there before we were ever created. So there's no biblical evidence for any human dying and becoming an angel. It's just not there. So number one, it's theologically wrong, but number two, don't try to comfort somebody with those words. Please don't do that. Just be there. Okay. Next, we have, Ecclesiastes in slide 33. Again, we must always remember in Ecclesiastes to interpret passages in light of the entire book and the ultimate answer, which is found at the end. Understand that that phrase I spoke of earlier, under the sun. It's like this under the sun. That is everything that is earthly. It's an earthly perspective. It's an earthly pessimistic outlook, okay, without God in it. he tries to find pleasure. He tries to find meaning in pleasure, in riches, in women, sex, in building projects, in gardening. He tries to find meaning in life in all of these things without God in the picture. And therefore, it's all meaningless, because we were born naked with nothing, and we will die and be put in a grave with just, for decency's sake, we will have some clothes on, but they're certainly not going to be going with us. Okay? But that's all we'll have with us. And whatever we have with us in the grave is not going to survive, beyond this life. So it's without God in the picture, it's meaningless, and that's what the next slide has to do with. The idea of the word that is used in Ecclesiastes. The Hebrew word is Hebel, or some people pronounce it Hevel, Hevel. The B is sometimes pronounced hard or soft with a V sound, depending on what the word is, and so forth. But this is a word that is translated vanity in some translations. It is translated, emptiness. It basically has to do with things that look as if they have substance, but in reality they do not. It's kind of like a vapor, a mist that you reach out your hand and try to grab, and there's nothing there. So that's what things on this earth are without God in the picture. Okay? Just like I said a little while ago, a man who had everything, could buy anything he wanted, but he said, when I got to that point, I lost my purpose. I lost my meaning for life, because that's all he had. He did not have God in the picture. And once he got God in the picture, then things got better for him as far as his outlook and his attitude and his meaning, feeling like he had a meaning in life, or a purpose in life. Okay? So again, Ecclesiastes is filled with this particular word here on slide 34. Now, grasping the text in their town, apart from God, life is meaningless. Wisdom itself is not bad, but it does not provide meaning if it's not put in the context of God and His will, and us bringing glory to Him. Okay? Again, grasping the text in their town, wisdom does not explain the contradictions in life. It only points them out. Therefore, just trust in God for His strength. And trusting Him means that you obey Him, okay, as best as you can. And then, again, grasping the text in their town, life, therefore, is not a puzzle to be completely understood, but it is a gift to be enjoyed. Notice again the attitude with which we look at life. If we look at life through the eyes of God, then we will consider everything we have to be a gift, and we'll enjoy life to its fullest, even during the bad times. Again, I'm not saying that it's all going to be good and we're always going to feel good. I'm saying that everything in the context of God and His will and His word, can be considered a gift. Okay? And we're not always going to understand everything that happens. But when we trust in God, when we rely on His strength and His word and obey Him to the best of our ability, then we can look at everything as a gift from God. God is allowing me to suffer now so that I can be prepared to walk with those who suffer. Even, Paul says that in Corinthians, I believe. Understand that the suffering you're going through will make you prepared for helping others when they go through the same thing or a similar thing. Okay? Next, measuring the width of the river across, we must understand that Ecclesiastes has a limited understanding of death, and I have to say I don't really like that idea. Just trying to keep it short here. It could be that the author is, again, only looking at death from an earthly perspective, and therefore he says, there's nothing beyond the grave. There's, all that sort of thing. If you just look at life from an earthly perspective, from a perspective, at least in our time, that we don't see a resurrection, okay, of the dead, which happened during the prophets and happened during the time of Jesus and the apostles and so forth. So we don't look. We look at the graveyards where we bury our loved ones, and we don't see them coming forth. So from our perspective, if we did not have the Bible, if we did not have a knowledge of God and the afterlife, then we would just conclude that, wow, that's all there is. I'm just going to be put in a box. My body is going to be put in a box at the end and buried in the ground, and there's nothing beyond that. Then yeah. Then I'm just, there's nothing to live for. Okay? And then again, no concept of the afterlife. Again, I have to slightly disagree with that, in the fact that there are several statements throughout the Old Testament that tell us that the people of that time understood something beyond this life. Because David says of the child that he and Bathsheba have that dies, he says, I shall go to him, but he will not come back to me. And Abraham in Hebrews chapter 11 is said to have looked for a city whose builder and founder is God. So looking beyond this life. But as far as looking at things from an earthly perspective, in the book of Ecclesiastes, you don't see anything about an afterlife in this life. You see only death, and that's the end from our perspective, without God in the picture, without His Word in the picture. Okay? Moving on, Ecclesiastes, crossing the principalizing bridge. Due to the narrow river, most principles are similar to the statements that we listed in step 1. Okay? We, again, understand that looking at things from an earthly perspective is simply meaningless. Okay? But when you bring God in the picture, then everything makes sense, and we have purpose, and we have meaning. Okay? Consulting the biblical map, the New Testament stresses that our relationship with God is through Jesus Christ. We have a clear picture of a victorious afterlife in the New Testament. It's very clear, and when we look at life through that lens, then certainly everything is going to fall into place as far as sense and purpose and meaning. And then finally, grasping the text in our town. We need to remember that apart from a relationship with Jesus Christ, life is meaningless. And when we look at John 14:15, if you love me, you'll keep my commandments. John 15:14, you are my friend if you keep my commandments, if you do what I say. Then a relationship with Jesus Christ is a relationship that results in our obedience to Him. It's not some just friendship type situation, okay? It's it's a life of service and obedience to Jesus Christ. That's what the relationship is. Okay, I'm going to stop here and finish the rest of this in another session. So we'll pick up with slide 42 in the next session.